So the purpose for today, this afternoon, is to engage in a professional learning community to talk about effective feedback on student writing, okay? So let's just get started. Now, I'm going to be giving you the short version of this presentation. There's a long version that's like 8 hours, and then there's a short version that's like 2.5. You're gonna get about an hour and 20-minute version. So you might feel somewhat unsatisfied at the end of this, and I'll give you some ideas for follow-up conversations to have after this, okay? So here are our goals for this afternoon, is to deepen our understanding of formative and summative feedback on student writing, to assess some feedback on a student writer's essay. So I'll be giving you an essay that has feedback from 3 different teachers on it. So we'll look at the feedback that other teachers have given this student writer and then think about what are the characteristics of effective feedback. We'll also discuss the differences between effective and ineffective feedback related to clarity, specificity, and tone. And then we probably won't get to this, but you could certainly do it on your own time, is to write some effective feedback on a student writer's essay, okay? Any questions before we get started about our goals? Okay, so I want to just take a second to position this session in terms of formative assessment. So a key formative assessment strategy is giving feedback that moves learners forward, so that we look at what a student is doing, we provide them some feedback, and that feedback actually pushes them to the next level. But effective feedback also can clarify and share the learning intentions, what is the criteria for success, and our feedback can also activate students as owners of their own learning. So we're going to think about this in terms of a formative move rather than a summative move. Okay, and this will become clear to you as we go on. So let's get right into it. I'm going to ask you to open your folder, and in your folder you will see a green task sheet that says Evaluating and Responding to Student Writing, and you will also see behind that a handout that is stapled that has several excerpts from a larger chapter about giving effective feedback. What I'd like you to do is take about 10 minutes to read the excerpts individually, taking notes in response to the questions on your green task sheets. And then when everyone's finished, I'm going to have you just talk at your table in small groups about what you've written, okay? So let's start there. I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that, and I will keep time on this part, okay? So, yes, so read these excerpts and answer the questions on this green task sheet, okay? So it's been about 10 minutes, and if you haven't finished filling out your task sheet, that's just fine. So what I'd like you to do is take about another 10 minutes at your table to discuss your responses to these questions. And what I'd like is for every table to have someone who agrees to facilitate the conversation. All you have to do as the facilitator is just to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to talk, and also make sure that you get through each one of the questions. Now, what I think, just for logistical reasons, we'll have this be one table group, the 3 of you be another table group, the 2 of you, that's easy. You might have to fight for who becomes the facilitator, and then just the 3 of you. So again, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. So as I said, the facilitator makes sure everybody has a chance to talk and keeps an eye on the time. So make sure you keep an eye on the time. A few minutes to talk about some of the excerpts from this article. Specifically, what are some things that you highlighted as significant in this article? What were some of the things that really stood out to you and why? Yep.
Well, I thought excerpt 2, where students are afraid to write. because they're afraid to write because they're not certain how what they write is going to be scored. And they're so afraid of just the criticism that's going to come with it. Mm-hmm. And it talked about how papers are scored for the final paper, and the students are not receiving feedback as they're going through the writing. So it was like all that work and all those missed opportunities that could have been given to the student through conferencing. All that was lacking. So the students are like, well, I'm not a good writer. I know already what I'm going to get, so why should I even bother to write? Because they already setting themselves up for failure.
Yeah.
Over here we talked a lot about how the students are, for the most part, influenced, or their writing is influenced by their expectation of what their grade's going to be. You know, not if the assignment is some sort of fun, touchy-feely, you know, motivational assignment, that is secondary compared to what they expect to earn. Mm-hmm. And I could relate to that. When I was a kid in school, I didn't care what the assignment was. I was only concerned about what my score was going to end up being.
What's my grade going to be? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How about somebody else? Something that you found significant in this article that spoke to you or you thought was important?
Over here, we kind of, or I kind of mentioned about how in excerpt 3, it's talking about, you know, over-correcting and putting a lot of red ink, so to speak, on the paper. I believe Ms. Thomas had mentioned that is how I remember being graded as I grew up in high school. That definitely was my predominant mode of feedback. And so my goal was just to get a little less red each time. You know, because you knew you were going to get something, but at least you were striving for a little less. But I was actually talking about in my own writer's workshops with my students, how some students do want more feedback. They don't want just, you know, 1 or 2 things to work on. They want the whole kit and caboodle at one time. And so you do have to kind of ration it out a little bit more for some students. And then for others, 1 or 2 things might be too much. You know, you might only say 1 thing because that might stifle them and say, oh, well, she just didn't like it. So you really do have to have a balance and know your students. And then, as Christina was saying, that is a good motivational tool because it makes the child curious and they want to know, you know, hey, what's going on with me? And we are forming that relationship in writing, and they know that I am responding to them. I'm not evaluating them, and that I can give them some feedback that's instructive, constructive.
And you're also speaking to that part down here about how can responses act as individualized instructional opportunities. As you said, some kids really want and can handle loads of feedback. A lot of other students can handle 1 or 2 comments, 2 major things they have to do. You know, they want to throw the paper away and they might as well just start over. How about other people who found something significant in this article that they wanted to bring up, or these excerpts?
I felt that excerpt 8 was significant in the fact that it differentiates between evaluating and responding. And sometimes, you know, as teachers, it can get a little cloudy as to which one that you're doing when you're trying to get things graded, hurry up and get things done with those deadlines that were put under. But just having that in front of you, it helps differentiate the two and helps the teacher to better formulate feedback that is both motivates the student, but at the same time, you know, instructs them on the things that they need to correct.
Yeah, so you brought up the word constructive, you brought up the word instructive. Our feedback, our responses should be both of those things. Should tell them what we're thinking about the paper as a reader and give them some, you know, instructional next steps. Yep.
And to kind of piggyback on that, excerpt 7 was the one that I found with that was the music teacher. I just like the way that they said that evaluating problems that are within a student's reach to correct. And that's where the personal aspect comes in. It's like, do you really know the student based on not just the words on the paper, but what they're trying to convey, their creativity, their imagination. Because although they may have punctuation mistakes, you know, run-on sentences but is the imagination, is the creativity there in the words?
Mm-hmm.
So, evaluating that the problems that are within their reach is better than just looking at the whole thing. So that was something that really stood out to me.
A number of people had talked about the Excerpt 7. I heard a number of people talk about that being significant to them. And go ahead.
I was, but I think it was where the responding instead of the evaluation. I took it personally in that I find that if I'm evaluating something, a student is not, they don't want to be told they're wrong. It's like, I don't want anybody telling me my writing's wrong. But if it's response, and if it's a genuine response, and it has properties of genuine, I would like to know more, or can you clarify this? I think the students are more motivated, more ready to try either to clarify themselves or to make a new stance, or to go deeper into their own thoughts instead of just seeing big old red marks there, or just, oh, that's good, or you need to improve. But if it's a genuine response, comment, I think they're more motivated. And it doesn't have to be many, just one or two.
So great segue to think about what are genuine responses, and what are those responses that really provide feedback that moves learners forward. Now, one of the things I do, actually two things I want to bring up. We'll be looking at this afternoon written responses. Now, what we're talking about here in terms of characteristics of effective written responses also apply to conferencing. So, anything we talk about, so I'm not saying, oh, written responses are the way to go. Conferring is actually a great thing to do. It takes probably a lot less of your time, and it also allows you to have that conversation with the student. Just for these purposes, it's easier to look at written responses. So that was the one thing. And the other thing I want to bring up is one of her big arguments, which is if we're only looking at the final paper, we're way too late in that process. And I know in my own work as a writer and as a student, I found that it was a trial and error thing as well. I just want to get less comments. I didn't know what I did well. I didn't really know what I did wrong either, but I knew I did a lot of stuff wrong. And so that's kind of with the frame of reference that we want to look at these papers. So what I'd like you to do is this. We're going to look at some responses that some teachers gave to a student paper. So in your folder, you have another green task sheet that says, hold on, assess feedback on students' rough draft. And then behind it, you have, it says here, a student sample. And I apologize, the grade is wrong on this student sample. It is not 6th grade, it was an 8th grade sample. At the top of this sample, you have the task that students were given, and that's the task that they responded to. The very first page of this sample is the student's essay without any comments on it at all. Then you go here and you have teacher 1's feedback, then you have teacher 2's feedback, and teacher 3's feedback. Remember, this is a rough draft. This is students' first draft that they're handing in, and these are the responses that they got. What I'd like you to do is first read the assignment in the student's response and jot down 2 things you think this writer needs to work on. So if this was a writer in your class, where would be the direction you would go with this student? 2 things. And then change your frame of reference and imagine that you are the student writer. You wrote this paper, and this is the feedback that was given to you. Which comments would be helpful to you? Which would not? And why would they be helpful? Why wouldn't they be helpful? So those questions are on your task sheet. So first think as a teacher, and then I'd like you to think as that student writer. And then we'll share those responses. One last thing, is that it was written in response to the text, "Thank you, ma'am." If you have not read that text recently, there are some copies there on your table. You might want to skim through that text, but I think it's a text that probably a lot of you know pretty well. But if you don't, here are some copies of it that I will need to take back from you. Okay, so have at it. So yeah, move move on to looking at the responses that the teachers gave to this student and thinking about the comments which are helpful, which aren't. Let's talk about teacher one. Comments. Which comments would you find helpful? Which wouldn't you? What did you think of teacher one? Yep.
It was a little bit vague and not specific by saying a bunch of places, and sometimes you don't have enough evidence, and then she said, or the teacher said, you need a title to get full credit. It's not exactly encouraging. It might be a little more positive to say, don't forget the title with a happy face or something like that.
You need the happy face. Okay.
Yeah.
How about somebody else? Teacher one. Yep.
I thought the same thing. She started off, or whoever teacher, started off really good, saying great opening paragraphs. You think you're going to get some great feedback on the start. But after that, it kind of gets a negative undertone. Don't do this. Remember to do this. So it's kind of, yeah, you start off good and then beat you down the rest of the way.
Okay. But I have to say one positive thing. That's what this teacher reminds me of. I need to find one positive thing to say. That's what they taught me. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I kind of took it the other way, because even though she said great opening paragraph, as a student, I might not know what's great about it. How can I duplicate it? And so I was thinking, again, that it was vague, as you said, for a student that's receiving this feedback. And then one thing that I did put that was positive is at the bottom, where she says, explain how this develops the theme. That gives the student room to grow and to expand on it. Maybe they do know how to explain, they just didn't put it in there. So that was kind of a non-threatening, but everything else almost was a negative for me. Even at the end, she says, great opening, great conclusion, but I don't know what makes it great. What did you like, and then why didn't you like everything else? If that was so great, that's what I would be thinking as a student.
Yeah.
Well, I focused on the develop a theme. How does this develop a theme? I think that's a term that the student may not fully understand what that means. It's in the task prompt, but what does it mean to develop a theme? And in the subsequent examples, we saw some different ways that teachers worded the explanation, and I think that may be a missing piece for the students to really understand what that means.
I concur as well. I felt like in the opening, I wrote that it was a good quote, but then they said that it was a great opening, and I wanted to know what was great about it as well if I were a student, so that someone used the word to duplicate. And I know that you weren't asking about teacher two's feedback.
Not yet.
But they did go into more detail, because the student may want to know, when they said, I'm not sure how this connects to the theme, giving an example without giving an answer would be helpful.
So one of the things, I'm going to kind of collapse two tasks. As you're talking, I'm going to write down some of the things that you're saying that we know makes feedback on students' drafts useful. And one of the things I want to get to is that sort of specificity that you talked about, that a number of you talked about. If we don't tell students what's good about something, they don't know what to repeat. So they might think, oh, I have to change everything, or nothing's good about this, or, you know, we need to give them some specificity for the good and for what needs work. Yeah. Other things about teacher one that you saw. Yep.
The comments, nothing really referred to the content of the paper. It was all correcting things that Alice developed the theme, or the quotation mark words of truth. It never referred to the actual content of the students including in the paper.
So remember, this is a rough draft, and where we really want to be in a rough draft is on the content. And so oftentimes when we give feedback on content stuff and on grammar, we're giving kids mixed messages. So you want me to revise this paragraph, however, you're adding in a comma when I need it. So what do I actually need to do? Do I need to rewrite the paragraph, or do I just need to put some commas in? And we know that kids will probably do what is easiest to get done. All right, so if I need a couple commas, I am ignoring that whole rewrite part, and I'm looking at the comma thing, and that's where I'm going to focus.
And that's what I found that kids do. Because I saw, you know, use quotation marks, things like that. I wouldn't even focus on initially, because that's what they're gonna do. That's the easiest thing to do. Let me put 2 of those and I'm good.
I'm done
You
here,
know,
yeah.
And that's what they'll do when maybe I don't even want that there at all. Maybe you need to rewrite that completely, and maybe you don't even need quotation marks anymore.
Right.
So it's like the content is so much more important initially, and then you can clean everything up towards the end.
Right, exactly. Yep. Anything else about teacher 1? So let's go to teacher 2. What'd you think? What'd you think? Helpful comments? Not helpful?
I thought it was very positive. I mean, just, if I was going to have a teacher score my paper, I would want her to score it. Because she's very positive, and then when she is given feedback, she also gives me some feedback to help me in leading in a way that maybe I can improve my paper.
So give us an example.
For example, it says, well, it says, I got a little lost here. I'm not sure I see how Roger's sitting away from the curse develops a theme. It seems like he might want to stay with Mrs. Jones' actions and explain their connection to the theme. How does leaving her purse out and providing Roger with the money develop the theme? So it's given me a way where I can really go and focus in on how to make an improvement to my paper. So her feedback really guides me in my writing. And so I think as a writer, I'm going to be more committed to really following up on what she's saying to improve my paper.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And just building on that too, I liked how she said, as opposed to the first teacher who kind of just marked out the slang words and corrected them, she kind of put the responsibility back on him, saying, you know, she tells him, for example, in paragraph 2, consider using words like boy or young man. It's kind of like, Cleanna said, it's kind of like she put a smiley face there without actually putting one. She's kind of saying it in a nicer way, but then also putting the responsibility back on him so he can actually go back and look through the paper and try and find other slang words he can correct.
I liked it. I liked it a lot in the sense that the comments were very personal. I like the way that she modeled thinking. It's like she was thinking through the text and showing them how to do that, you know.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, just the part that she kind of piggyback on her part where she said I got a little lost. I'm not sure how Roger sitting away from the purse develops a theme. It seems like he might want to stay. In other words, she's thinking through the thought for him in this aspect, but also too in the ending, her ending statement, she says, as a reader. So she's letting him know that, you know, I'm your audience. You're addressing this to me, and she asks them, you know, she puts, like she's saying, she puts the responsibility back on him when she says, where could you use help? However, is he understanding some of the evidence you would use? You know, I'm a little bit confused with this, so how would you use this evidence? So I thought, you know, really good points, but this teacher obviously knows her students. She has a real good relationship with them.
So
write these kind of comments.
So, and you know, one of the things that I notice about the difference between 1 and 2, 1 is like, I am the teacher grading your essay and I'm going to tell you the things you need to fix. Whereas you mentioned it, teacher 2 is saying, I am a reader. The goal of writing is to communicate ideas to an audience. I am your audience and this has not been communicated to me. Not like, you know, if you do this, then you get a better grade. It's like this point didn't come across. Yeah, you were going to say something. Sorry.
All this feedback I think is excellent too, but isn't it kind of unrealistic given the parameters of this job?
So that...
I mean, because I had, like just for example, you know, I have close to 140 students. Mm-hmm. I mean, this would be a monumental task to do this type of evaluation for a rough draft for every paper. I don't know how it's not even realistic to think you could handle, you know.
So I'm glad you brought that up. The longer version of this has us think about ways to manage this paper load. As I said before, what we're talking about here is right now these are written, but you could probably get some of this across in a verbal comment. The other thing I want to point out about teacher 2 is there is a lot of writing for sure on that, and probably more than any of us can handle. I think 2 things about it. One is she really does focus him on just 2 things. One is explaining evidence. I forget what the other one is. Connecting to the thesis. The other thing is I would probably say that those end comments are not needed. That they seem somewhat redundant to what's on the side. So I think that's one way to sort of limit it. But she really does only focus on 2 things. So I think one way to limit the paper load is to say, what are the things that I am going to focus on this rough draft? I want to see a thesis statement, and I want to see evidence that connects to that. That's all I'm looking for, kids. I'm not looking for anything else. Everything else will go by the wayside for this feedback on this rough draft. Because I agree, there's a ton of stuff here. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with all the comments that have been made about teacher number 2's feedback, but specifically the 2 areas that you all cited about I got a little lost here. I like how she starts that off. The only thing that I didn't like is where she begins to guide the student in a specific direction. It seems like you might want to stay with Mrs. Jones' actions. Instead of doing that, because I'm telling the student this is what's going to be right, is to stay with this action. I would leave it up to the student and allow them to explain their point there and give them that option instead of telling them this is the direction that's going to be best for you.
Or maybe as the teacher, I know now I need to do a little mini lesson on selecting evidence, and that's something we need to work on as a class rather than me telling the student this time with this example.
And it allows the student to formulate that, and he might go with that. But if I tell him, then he thinks, or she thinks, you know, this is what I have to do because she told me to do it. So that was the only one comment that I put as negative that might, you know, detract from progress.
And I don't want to make any assumptions as to where this teacher is going as far as the technical aspects of the paper. This teacher obviously focuses on the content. It's something that teacher 1 did, the teacher 2 does not, is point out misspelled words. That teacher 2 leaves that out altogether, and you know, I would hope that is taken care of at a later date, but sometimes, you know, the student sees that, okay, everything's fine, and then they're not aware that there are misspelling certain words.
Yeah, so one option is to say, well, I'm just going to focus on thesis or whatever, and then in a whole class to say, you know, there are a number of you who have misspelled words. I did not mark those on your paper, but developed has another E in it, or something like that, that there are some things that we can address whole group, because I think that we burn ourselves out as English teachers when we become editors. And teachers, I mean, students often expect us to be editors. I remember my students would say, you missed a spelling error that I made. I know, because that's not what I was looking at. Yeah, but you missed it. You know what I mean? So they get into that habit of, you know, wanting that from us. Quickly, teacher number 3. Thoughts, comments, helpful, not helpful?
I know this
You know teacher number 3?
I thought it was a decent amount of useful feedback. And it was pretty much all just grammatical corrections.
It wasn't much about the academic thinking that the student needed to demonstrate.
But in his defense, in the student's defense, sometimes these brief comments are all I need.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Sometimes I don't need all of that, you know. I guess you can say it just depends on the paper and the situation. But
And your relationship with the writer that you had brought up before.
Exactly. So if it's, you know, if it's the kind of situation where it's time and you know I work on it, this is what I need.
So one thing I would say that this teacher doesn't do is doesn't provide anything that the student does well and needs to continue doing. So oftentimes people say, oh, you know, the touchy-feely stuff. Our positive comments aren't about being touchy-feely. It's not about boosting kids' self-esteem, although they often do that. But those positive comments are to help them as writers know what to continue writing. So it is important to give those positive things that kids do well on. We only have like 7 minutes left. So let's think about this list. We have a couple things on here, actually more than a couple, like 6, things about useful feedback on students' rough draft. What would you add to this list, given your own experience, given what you've read in those excerpts? I'm going to add something that came up before, which was focused on a few things, giving the caveat that it somewhat depends on the student, but it doesn't have everything that's wrong.
So I wonder if there was like criteria that the students were given, or like a rubric that maybe some of the feedback could be based on that.
So focused on assignment criteria, right? You know, what are the demands of the assignment, and our feedback should be focused there. Yeah.
To go with the comment about the spelling and errors, I think if you told the students in advance, on this rough draft, this will be my focus, so the students will know. I realize that there are misspelled words or other errors, but that's not what I'm looking for this part of the rough draft that we'll be focusing on this week, so that the students know I'm going to be judged on the content, and these specific criteria will give the kids the direction, so they'll know your comments are only towards that direction.
Mm-hmm. Other things that you would add to this list?
I guess I wonder if there's a lesson that goes on about formal writing, because I know teacher 2 gives an example, the same boy or young man, but that's not the only part. So what is academic language for the kids familiar with the differences? Because sometimes we find that these students have not been privy to the difference between academic language and what's acceptable and unacceptable.
Yeah, so I would put that under sort of use language students understand, and uses the language of the classroom. You know, so that your comments, like you said, it shouldn't say use academic language if kids have no idea what academic language is. So our comments are tied to our instruction.
And that kind of goes back to what she said, the rubric. You could put that in that aspect of the structure.
Right.
I know you guys are basically text language.
Yeah, big time.
Right. Right, like that's the language of texting for a certain particular purpose and audience.
Right.
This essay, not texting. Not texting language. Other things that need to be on that list. So before we go, I just want to do just 2 things. I want to just share with you what research says, various research studies that show where students have improved their writing given feedback. And again, this is writing on rough drafts where students are going to make revisions. So we have a number of these. This text-specific one, the reason behind this is that quite often the research shows that comments can be lifted from one paper and put on the next paper, and that it should be engaging with this actual paper that we're reading. And I think that we had all of these already. So just to show that in terms of the difference between responding to final draft feedback, this is what they say about final draft feedback. Focus the comments only on the assignment criteria, comment on the strengths, identify patterns of error in students' writing. So I see this is a pattern that happens frequently. And then put the comments in terms of students' writing across the year. Boy, your introductions are really great. Now let's focus on your conclusions. 2 big things from the research that say is if you want your kids to revise their writing, don't put a grade on it. A grade signifies that something is done. It also means what typically happens when kids get their grades, what do? They look at their own paper, they look at their friend's paper, and then they stick it in their backpack. They don't tend to look at the comments. So if you want them to use the comments, then don't put a grade on it. But that has implications, right, for final draft feedback, which means on your final draft, don't spend hours commenting on final drafts. You're better off putting a grade on it, marking on the rubric, and leaving it as it is. If you spend hours and hours commenting on the final draft, you're commenting on the wrong time, you're wasting your time, and kids aren't getting anything out of it. So that's a hard sell, though, for teachers, for parents and administrators. Just wanted to say that. Okay, we have to go, but in your folder you have some other resources for you. One is about ineffective and effective feedback in terms of specificity, tone. It says guidelines for giving effective feedback. It's on a white sheet of paper. So that's another resource in there. A good place to go next is for you guys to share all your ideas about how to manage the paper load. How are you able to give thoughtful responses on students' rough drafts without killing yourselves and having no life, being the English teacher with no life, okay? If you would, before you go, if you have time, I don't know if you do, if you would fill out the reflection at the very end, that would be grand. I don't know if we had enough time to actually go through